All right, everyone. Well, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am Michelle Glightly. I'm one of the school counseling specialists at the Utah State Board of Education. Also today with us is Bethany Marker, who is the other school counseling specialist here. She will be leading a presentation later in our series, but thanks so much for joining us today to talk about the role of the school counselor. This is the first of 3 different webinars that we will have to really focus on supporting school counselors in charter schools. But I do want to start with a shout out to everyone. We're on the 3rd day of National School Counseling Week. So I hope you've had a great week and have been able to support your program by recognizing things that you're doing and also getting recognized for the good work that you do. So Bethany and I really want to make sure that you know how much we appreciate the work that you do in the schools and everything that you do to support students. So thank you for being school counselors and supporting all the students in Utah. That kind of leads us right into our first bit of this presentation. There's a lot of words on here, but really as school counselors, we have a mission and vision to support all students, right? So we're really making sure that every student has access to a school counselor and the school counseling program. And we want to make sure that we're really focusing on student outcomes, right? Like, what is the purpose of the school counseling program, right? We want students to be successful, reach their goals, and have plans for life after high school. So it's really important that we are involved in a lot of conversations and education because we play a really big role in that Tier 1 support for all students. So the role of the school counselor, we have a lot of this information in our program model. So you see on there the link for the Utah College and Career Readiness School Counseling Program Model. That is kind of our be-all book that can give you support for any questions that you have. We'll talk about this in a minute, but just such a useful tool to aid in the work that we do and to help others understand the work that we do. So it is a comprehensive program, and we have our 4 domains of our student mindsets and competencies of academic learning, life, career, multicultural, global citizenship, and then that social emotional supports piece. So with that, we know that we do direct services and indirect services, right? Those are kind of the 2 big categories of school counseling. So in that direct service, those are all the things that we're doing when there's a student with us, right? So we're doing classroom instruction, we're working with them individually, the plan for college and career readiness, developing career literacy, all of those things are direct services. Our indirect services are all of the things that we're doing on behalf of students, right? So this is where advocacy, our collaboration, consultation, referrals, all of those things are happening as indirect services. So those are kind of the 2 broad categories that we have for spending our time. So the way that we deliver that program is we have these 4 different delivery areas. So hopefully these all sound familiar, and we do have recommendations of how much time you should spend in each of these areas, but we have our plan for college and career readiness, our systemic approach to dropout prevention with social emotional supports, we have collaborative classroom instruction, and then we have that program management piece. So we're going to kind of go over those a little bit more in depth. So the plan for college and career readiness is found in multiple places. It's found in state statute, and it's found in USBE board rules. So this is a lot of places. So it tells us it's really important, right? So one of the key things with that is the years that we have our meetings, group and individual. So 7th and 8th grade, 1 group, 1 individual, the same in 9th and 10th. And 11th and 12th, right? That's something that I think I see fairly often being missed when I do formal program reviews. So really making sure that the group CCR meeting is only once out of those 2 years, right? So that might mean collaborating, and depending on the structure of your charter school, some of these grades might look a little differently. And making sure that this plan for college and career readiness is not a single meeting. We're going to have another webinar that talks about that and how this connects with course planning, but really making sure that those meetings include course planning, but also that transition planning, setting goals, talking about that career literacy piece, right? Yeah, it's more than just course selection. And it's also giving them kind of that advisement as well as transition planning. So our systemic approach to dropout prevention with social emotional supports, right? Previously known as responsive services. As Tier 1, we know that we work with all students, And we know that school connectedness really helps with dropout prevention. So that's one place that we can really make an impact, is that school engagement and connectedness piece and having that one caring adult. So this is something that's done at the tier 1 level for all students to build that connection at school. And then we work on it maybe in the tier 2 with some individual or small group counseling. And then we also have that tier 3 where we might need to refer to either other specialists in our schools or in the community. And then we also have this kind of crisis counseling that's separate from that tier. And there's a whole another training that we can do to talk about crisis counseling. But just know that there's multiple tiers that we can be working in to help students engage with the school and get the support and resources they need to be successful, both with academics and non-academic topics. And again, really making sure that we're collaborating in this area. We talked about a tiered approach already, but also making sure that we're involved in the student support team, SST, lots of different names for that team, but making sure that we're involved in those conversations to know what the issues are in the school to make changes to our program, right? Really using data to guide our program to see where do we need to maybe focus more of our efforts on tier 1. Right? So as we're looking through those things, maybe something that we typically do in tier 2 is just having so many students need those supports that maybe we think about how do we do this at a tier 1 level, right? Again, PBIS is another tier 1 intervention, right? That's going to be school-wide, and school counselors are a really integral part of that as well, to make sure that behavior expectations are taught, reinforced, and having that reward piece as well. Also, things that are done like school-wide would be like restorative practices and trauma-informed practices, and just really being a part of the teams and leadership that are making sure that these practices are implemented and implemented school-wide. So our collaborative classroom instruction, right? We're going into the classroom to help students gain knowledge and skills, right? We're looking at both academic and non-academic skills in this area, right? So we might talk about study skills and organization in our lessons, but we might also have lessons that are talking about how do we cope with anxiety, right? What can we do when we're having a struggle, right? And so this is really making sure that we're reaching all students with this content, right? So making sure that we're looking at our data to inform our lessons. So we can look at our systemic assessment, we can look at our curriculum delivery survey, or we can just look at our school data summary. Lots of sources of data that we can use to determine what are the skills and knowledge that students need, that we need to teach all students as we go into the classroom. So we do have our 4 areas. This is kind of our strands and standards, scope and sequence that we have in other academic areas. As counselors, we have our student college and career readiness mindsets and competencies. So like I mentioned previously, we have these 4 areas, and within these 4 areas, there's multiple standards and indicators, and that's really where we want to pull from as we decide topics that we're going to teach in the classroom. So really making sure we're hitting all of those and not trying to do too much in a single lesson, right? So really being intentional and focused on doing that instruction. So beyond that collaborative classroom instruction, we can also offer this to parents with maybe some parent workshops. And then it's also important to remember the power of some interdisciplinary work, right? We hear a lot of great examples of working like with English teachers to work on resumes or essays, right? And then having the school counselor support with that. Lots of different options with how we can connect our curriculum with those that are teachers, so we can have that really interdisciplinary work together. So our last category is that program management piece, right? We really want to limit this because we want our time to be with students. But in this program management piece, that's when we're doing some advocacy and outreach. That's where we're kind of doing all of the kind of tasks to make sure our program can be implemented, and where we want to have our professional learning, right? So really important that we're staying up to date with all of the changes. Right now, the legislative session is happening. Once that's done, there's going to be some new laws that we need to make sure we stay up to date with. So always making sure we're having that experience to know the most recent different laws, policies, best practices. So that leads us right into our board rules. So there's 2 kind of really big board rules when it comes to school counseling. So we have R277-462, which are our school counseling program rule. So our entire school counseling program model that we've talked about is incorporated by reference into that rule. So that means that it is a board rule. All of that information in that document has to be followed as if it was in the board rule. Also, it talks about that plan for college and career readiness that we just covered, of making sure the individual and group meetings are happening, as well as what that kind of looks like, the elements that should be in that meeting. It also is where we have our school counselor to student ratios, right? So in this rule, it says that there needs to be one school counselor for every 350 students, and that's done at an LEA level. So for charters, that's a little bit different since you don't typically have multiple schools that you're working with. So it might be your individual school that is the LEA level to meet that ratio. And this is also where all of our program accountability and funding is as well. So if you are an approved program, you are pretty familiar with this accountability process and getting funding. If you're not an approved charter program, this would be a great place to look for kind of those expectations. Our next webinar in this series is going to talk more about the review process, the standards, the accountability. So if that's something you're interested in, definitely come to our next webinar in this series to learn more about that, or reach out to me and Bethany so that we can kind of help you see where your program is at right now and what might need to happen to get you to a level where you become an approved program and are eligible for this funding.
Michelle, real quick, can I interrupt on that?
Absolutely.
With the school ratios, that is just for 7th through 12th grade. So we do have a lot of charters that are K through 8, a few that are K through 12. So when we look at those ratios, it is just for 7th through 12th graders for the funding.
Yes, that is an excellent clarification, that entire rule is really looking at secondary 7 through 12. Our other really big school counseling board rule, R277464, this one is different from the previous rule. This one is K-12. So this rule applies to all school counselors, whether or not you're in an approved program, the grade level, any of that information. And this is our direct and indirect services rule that talks about using 85% of our time in direct services. So this is kind of pulled directly from that rule, saying that LEAs need to make sure that school counselors are using their time in those approved appropriate duties, and that those inappropriate activities are not in their list of duties. And it actually calls out elimination of non-counseling duties such as test coordination and administration. So that kind of is one of those big pieces that we hear a lot that's taking counselors' time, is that test coordination, administration, master schedule building, all those kinds of things. So this rule says, regardless of your program, grade level, anything like that, if you are acting as a school counselor, you need to follow this board rule with our direct and indirect services. So in that, we do need to make sure that our non-school counseling duties are taken out, right? So that, like we talked about, test coordination, master schedule building, student discipline, substitute teaching, right? All of those things that we know school counselors should not be doing. However, we do know that there's also that fair share of responsibilities, just like any other educator at the school, right? So sometimes teachers are asked to do different things as school counselor for part of that kind of rotation of fair share responsibilities. So that's kind of the one small caveat. So just be mindful of that. And we know with COVID and other things, there's a shortage. So we need to make sure that we are engaging in that fair share responsibility, but also maintaining some fidelity to our school counseling program model and to this rule about what are counseling duties and non-counseling duties. So there's a lot of different things that are direct services and that are appropriate for school counselors to complete. This is all available in that board rule, but I just want to highlight specifically on this page, the last bullet point, that we provide short-term, individual, small group, large group counseling services, right? So we are short-term counseling as school counselors, right? Other things, we are really making sure we're collaborating with people, right? So you'll see most of these say collaborate, right? So making sure we're collaborating with all of the people in the building, whether that be teachers to go in their classroom, other student support specialists, so making sure we're collaborating with like a school social worker or student advocates, behavior assistants, all those people to make sure that we are really supporting students as a cohesive team. And again, this is another hot topic. We advocate for students at IEP meetings, 504 meetings, all of those different meetings, right? We want to be there and be part of that conversation to give our perspective, to be an advocate for the student. But we'll see in the next slide, we don't organize those. We're not in charge of those. We're really a support to those individuals that are kind of being the point person for that. And really just making sure we're involved in school level teams for leadership, for PBIS, to make sure that we are able to use our experience with data, with students, to make sure that we're addressing systemic needs, barriers, and identifying any issues at the school. So now some non-counseling duties, right? Building the master schedule, right? Not a school counselor duty. We may consult, we'll give our feedback, but we're not the main point person on that, right? Not organizing testing. And then again, the last bullet on this page talks about we do not provide long-term counseling and we don't touch therapy, okay? So we are short-term counseling. We're not providing anything long-term and we're not providing anything that's therapeutic or clinical. And another one, we don't discipline students, right? We really want to make sure that we keep our role as a school counselor to support students as they are maybe having issues with attendance or disciplinary things, that we're helping them with that return to learn piece. And we also make sure that we're not doing that data entry clerical stuff. Okay. So again, we do not coordinate all of those plans and meetings, but we want to be there as an advocate. And then also assisting with any principal duties, right? We may be in the office or close proximity to it, but we are not going to be a replacement principal, right? So the complete chart of all of these appropriate and inappropriate duties is available in that board rule. So we know that that's kind of the expectation, right? That we have all of these things that we want you to do and we expect from you, but we know that there are definitely challenges. So I'm going to try to get my other notes to pull up so that we can talk a little bit about that. Sorry, you have to see my face real close. So with that, we want to make sure that we are aware of our multiple roles, right? So we know some charters, maybe you don't have a special test coordinator and you're asked to do some of that, right? So really making sure you're defining when you're using which hat, right? Am I in my school counselor hat? Am I in this other role, right? And really being clear with that designation of your time with all the stakeholders, right? So having those conversations frequently, right? And based on the needs that you're seeing about how your time is being asked to be used. So making sure teachers know, parents know, students know, your administrators know that this time I'm taking this role and here's my expectations of this time. Maybe another time I'm going to have this different role and here's my expectations and boundaries at that time, right? So with this, that administrative support is super, super important. It's so important that we have a whole separate webinar about it. That's going to be our third and final webinar that we're going to talk about having that annual administration meeting. So yes, absolutely have that annual meeting, but you might need to have them more frequently, right? You might need to have kind of a mid-year check-in to make sure that all of those different roles are really clear and you're meeting those expectations of time with students, right? That direct services time is so important because the more we get pulled away from those counselor duties and we're doing non-counselor duties, our program suffers, right? And with that, we lack the data and evidence to say school counselors are important. So it really kind of starts a slippery slope of pulling us away from our focus as school counselors. So with that, also really important that we kind of keep that fidelity to the school counseling program model. So know the model, know the delivery components, be really clear on your role as a school counselor so we can keep our focus on what we do as school counselors, which is student success and focusing on student outcomes, right? So we have a lot of documents to help support you in those conversations. We just went over 2 of those board rules. Like I mentioned, there's also some state statutes that you can refer to kind of help clear up what we do as school counselors. And just know that it's really difficult, I know with shortages, to have everyone doing those real clear roles. But it's so important to have those conversations even when they're difficult, right? We always encourage our students to have those difficult conversations with their teachers, with their families, and we need to have those difficult conversations as well, right? So we kind of have both extremes of maybe we're getting pulled to do something that's kind of a principal role with discipline, or we're getting pulled in the opposite direction to do something like data entry, right? So really making sure that you're clear in your role and having that conversation with all those stakeholders so they know your role. So with that, we do have a second webinar that's going to talk all about the program review and accountability. That's going to be coming up on March 15th. And then that third webinar is going to be about collaboration with your administration. And that one's going to be in April. But if you have any questions about your role as a school counselor, how to have those conversations, anything like that at all, please feel free to reach out to us via email, and we are happy to have those conversations and point you in the right direction so that you can really maintain fidelity to the school counseling program model and to our role as school counselors. So thank you so much for joining us today. I am going to stop our recording. Oh, I stopped the share, and